Hello, everyone. This week you've been reading about the Progressive Era. This is the period of time that connects to the reading you've been doing in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, in case you haven't made that connection. This was an era at the beginning of the 1900s that really was marked with a lot of economic and social changes that I think are still felt in some ways today. Uh, Late in the 1800s, William McKinley was our president, and his administration had a very expansionist view of the United States, particularly in terms of its position as a global power. And during this era, there was quite a bit of activity in as far away as the Pacific to bring different islands and nations into the sphere of our influence, if not into what could have become an American empire around the world. For instance, I believe this was during this period of time when we conquered the Philippines, and there seemed to be little wars all over the place. The Spanish-American War occurred around the turn of the century. In fact, the Secretary of State for McKinley, his name was John Hay, referred to the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war. It was something that didn't last very long. The Secretary of the Navy during the war, Theodore Roosevelt, led a group of soldiers called the Rough Riders in Cuba, and stormed the hill and was very famous because of that. And he eventually was, I think, partly because of his notoriety, because of that battle. San Juan Hill is the battle. William McKinley picked him as his vice president in the 1900 elections. This was midway through what would have been McKinley's 8 years in office. But in 1901, McKinley was assassinated at I think in Buffalo, if I remember correctly, by an anarchist. And Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley lingered for a few days and then died from the gunshot wound. And Teddy Roosevelt, became our president. Actually, he was the youngest man to ever become president. I think he was 42 at the time that he assumed the presidency. He was elected again in his own right in 1904 and had most of those 8 years then as president. Roosevelt himself was a kind of a very famous man, and is one of the four presidents that is carved into Mount Rushmore. So, well, I don't know if that means he was important or whoever did the design liked him, but he probably was one of the best presidents in our history, in my own opinion. But in any event, as far as the political history is concerned, Roosevelt figured very much in the events of this era, in that he engaged in trying to invoke some government regulation with industry, which, as you recall from last week, we saw quite a dramatic growth in wealth in the late 1800s, and the prosperity continued through the 1900s, the early 1900s, at least for a certain segment of our population. But there were still people who were getting poorer and poorer, and as a result of this, this disparity between the wealthy and the poor became greater the whole time. And there was a period of time when industry was able to pretty much have its way with the consumer and with its employees, and so Roosevelt stepped in to try to regulate some of that. A little bit more of that later on. Just a reminder, this is the week that your papers on the jungle are due. And there is a new link on your course menu called Assignments. And if you find that link and click on it, you'll see that there's a place where you can either write in the text box or attach a paper from your computer. My preference would be, and I do hope you will do this, is rather than to have you typing in the text box, is to attach your paper as a separate attachment, and it will go there. I'll be able to access it at some point, hopefully in the near future, and read it and mark it up and grade it and give it back to you right in the same spot. So anyway, that's the place. The assignments link, I think, is fairly intuitive for those of you who have not used it before. And if you have problems with it, let me know. But those papers are due this week. I'm going to go ahead and put a note in the. I'm usually amenable to papers that arrive a little late for a while, so there will be a window of time when you can submit them, and then after that, that will be too late. So please do take the time to visit that and see when the papers must be turned in, but I really would hope to see them turned in this week. 3 to 6 pages. Don't feel like you have to write a novel here, but this is a paper that would be not only kind of a summary of the book in a bit, so that that I can tell from the paper that you've read the book, but also your reaction to it and how you respond to what was written in there and what your thoughts are about that book. Not only in terms of there's a lot of interest in the meatpacking industry in that book, and as I think I may have mentioned to you, that was sort of the big public reaction to the book, was about the abuses in the meatpacking industry and the concerns about the safety of the food that people were eating and things, and most people looked right beyond Sinclair's concern about the immigrant and about the poor people in general, and how the capitalists in society were taking advantage of and grinding up those individuals. And so as you write your paper and you come up with your reaction, I hope that your reaction kind of focuses more upon those issues about poverty and social welfare, and less upon the thought of how difficult it's going to be to eat hot dogs here for a little while. The early 1900s really was, again, as I mentioned, was an era of social change. We did see an increase in the democratic emphasis during this period of time. Citizens were becoming more involved, and government was becoming more responsive to them. Really, for the first time, there was the possibility that, the poor person could question control by the elite. And notice during this period of time, the statistics says that 5% of the population owned half of the nation's property. So really, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few in those days. And so it became possible for the individuals who were dispossessed to challenge those in control more, and through a number of different I think approaches and mechanisms, again, that we'll be talking about it here before this lecture is done. Here's another thing that happened in the early 1900s was government intervening to control big business. One of the businesses that Teddy Roosevelt took on in his efforts to, the term was trust busting, was the term that I think you may remember from American history. And Teddy Roosevelt trying to break up the big business trusts, and here he is wrestling the railroad industry to the ground. Teddy's looking pretty buff there, actually. I don't know that he was really all that built in those days, but in any event, I guess if you were an American citizen at the time, his efforts to try to break up get big business under control and to break up their power and influence must have made him seem like a pretty awesome guy. So there was a lot of more industrialization in the early 1900s and mechanization, and this really kind of changed the face of industry in many respects, with the big business having so much influence in the market, in the economic market. They were very powerful when it came to dealing with their employees, and so, among other things, the labor unions developed and really kind of organized individuals to bring about change. And so there was a number of reforms, partly led by the labor unions, I think partly also influenced by the fact that all around the world during this period of time there was a socialist revolution, so to speak, and at least in many countries, socialism was becoming more popular as a political philosophy. It was very threatening to the capitalists in America at the time. There were individuals running for president, in fact, who had a lot more success in those campaigns than most third-party candidates have. And in fact, I believe it was in I think the peak of success for was 1912, I believe. But even through the election of, I believe, 1920, a socialist candidate really was garnering a significant number of votes. Eugene V. Debs, you've probably heard of him, was the socialist candidate, sort of the perennial socialist candidate, at least in most of those elections. And although he never, there was never any danger of him actually becoming president, there was a point where he began to get a significant amount of votes, and for a socialist candidate. And in fact, he became influential enough, mind you, that in 1920, when he ran for president, he ran from Atlanta prison, federal prison. He was imprisoned for well, protesting, I think, or whatever. But if you really kind of look at the politics of the era, it certainly seems as though the government tried to tuck him away there and to make life very difficult for him. And so he still managed to get quite a bit of votes from prison. And so there was a concern that the socialist movement could really take hold in the United States. And so some of those reforms that were occurring, I think it was intended to kind of appease the people who were thinking about kind of signing on with the socialists. But after the war, and I'm talking about World War I here, that was the late, I think it was like 1917 to 1918 is when we were actually actively in the war ourselves. After World War I, the reform era died back again, and the movement really kind of evolved into what we now know to be the profession of social work. But reformers in the middle of this era, not at the beginning or the end, but in the middle of the era were really focusing on societal and institutional change, but both at the beginning and at the end of this period of time, once again, the root of economic problems was seen to be the individual. So the reforms brought about some change, but didn't really affect any lasting change in attitudes about the poor. Our society shifted from an agricultural one to one that was based upon industry and characterized by a lot of urban areas. The cities were growing pretty dramatically. Immigration continued, and in fact it was perhaps reaching its peak in the early 1900s. This is in fact, I think 1905 is when my grandmother and grandfather arrived in America with my father, and This was a period of time where a lot of people from Europe and Southern Europe and some of those other countries that, early on we had Irish and Germans immigrating, and as time went on, the all sorts of different populations with, Southern Europeans, for instance, in the census were not considered whites. They were considered Southern Europeans in the United States Census for a few decades after their arrival here. And the skin tones were different, and their lifestyles were different, and philosophies were very different. So not unlike today, immigrants were still viewed as with some suspicion, I suppose. And in fact, during this period of time, laws were implemented restricting immigration, and in fact, totally excluding individuals from Japan and China for a period of time. And in other areas, the immigration was kind of parceled out in percentages to certain countries, so that there was an effort to kind of control just who it was and what type of person was moving into the nation at that time. Industry was changing also as corporations began to actually happen, where instead of having an individual or a few people, private owners running big business, they were being controlled by boards of directors. As I mentioned earlier, the upper incomes were growing a lot more quickly than the working class incomes were, and it was very obvious to the working person in those days. Somewhere between a half to 2/3 of working class families were poor, and as this statistic points out, about a third of them were living in absolute poverty. And so this is working class families we're talking about. Unskilled laborers, tenant farmers were the ones who suffered the most, and if you were black and one of those individuals, you really had it even worse still. There were a couple Supreme Court decisions, or rather, well, one Supreme Court decision during this era I want to mention, or right before this era at least. And I want to take you back again. Remember, when we talk about Supreme Court decisions, I'm kind of hoping that you'll have a list available of these decisions. This is one of those things, that you might turn up in a test or something, and so it's just probably worth remembering. So 1857, if you recall the Dred Scott decision, I think talked about that 2 weeks ago, where persons of African descent, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled that persons of African descent were not protected by the Constitution at all, and thus were not U.S. citizens. And in particular, one of the outcomes of this was a decision or a ruling, so to speak, in this, that slaves were the property of their owners. In 1896, another Supreme Court decision that is remembered in history as far as civil rights is concerned, and in Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court upheld various state laws mandating racial segregation in public facilities, and said that such segregation was acceptable as long as the facilities were equal. So that established the separate but equal doctrine that really became standardized and law for the first half of the 20th century. This will be overturned in a subsequent ruling, in another 60 years or so. For that period of time, though, segregation was institutionalized in America, and so this went so far as to meaning that blacks and whites did not eat in the same restaurant, or if they did, they ate in separate sections of the restaurant. They had separate public bathroom facilities. They had separate water fountains. They sat in different sections of buses. All of those kinds of things. More on that later. But this was really the law of the land a little over 100 years ago. So anyway, two big court decisions there I want you to remember. Dred Scott in 1857, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The government was intervening to try to correct some things as well, and as I mentioned earlier, Teddy Roosevelt, the president at the turn of the century, was advocating for antitrust legislation with the intent of regulating big business better. And among some of the industries, the railroad industry, J.P. Morgan, and I think the name of his railroad was Northern Securities or something like this. And essentially, Morgan had such control over the railroads that he essentially controlled the shipment of goods all over the nation. Everything went through his company, and so you can imagine how he could manipulate prices and manipulate the market in order to for him to receive favorable expenses and costs and to increase his profits. And this is pretty much what was going on with big business in those days, that remember, this is this is capitalism, and so profit, that he who has the biggest profit is the most successful, or she who has the biggest profit. But in those days it would have been he anyway. And so the intent there was to maximize profits, and that's what capitalism sets up. And so big business, without any kind of control or regulation, those that were extremely successful not only could control their area of the business. It's not just the railroad that J.P. Morgan controlled, but because of the fact that he could control the costs of shipping things, he had exercised a lot of control over the industries or the individuals who provided the natural resources, the raw goods for the production of other things. So he really had control over a lot of areas of life. Likewise, other industries, not only could they outdo the competition because they were so big in their area, but also could begin to buy up the suppliers, so that they could regulate and control the price of the raw goods as well coming to them. Really not how capitalism is supposed to work, but that's how it was working. So the government, Teddy Roosevelt, decided he needed to step in and try to help that a little bit. Not surprisingly, a labor movement grows, given that the owners were really taking advantage of the workers, and there's a great example of that as you read The Jungle. I mean, you see that mentioned and described very thoroughly in that book. So the labor unions became very active, and this happened around the same time as the Socialist Party and the socialist movement was getting a foothold in the world and in the United States. And so in the minds of many individuals, the labor unions in general became associated with the Socialist Party or the communism eventually. And in the minds of many people today, labor unions still are sort of communist kinds of organizations or whatever. I mean, socialist organizations, and the reason for this kind of connection, I think, in our minds is that this is something that's been handed down over the last 100 years. About and it just kind of is coincidental that the two seem to grow at the same time. In 1913, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave the federal government the opportunity to collect taxes, income taxes, and doing that, gave the government the opportunity to redistribute income. It was getting taxes from people who make more, and then using those taxes for the well-being of individuals who were less fortunate. That's called income redistribution, and really that's social welfare programs are essentially income redistribution programs, where the programs that the public assistance programs and virtually every social program that is government funded is funded by the taxes that we all pay based upon the money that we earn. So some of the money is redistributed to other individuals who are needy. So this income tax, can you imagine that before 100 years ago, the government didn't take any taxes, and so that's one reason why probably Jurgis and his family had no services available to them other than the meager stuff that the charitable organizations could offer. And so the income tax amendment really provided the opportunity for a change in that. And with that, welfare programming begins to shift from private charities to local government. And as you'll see, it also involves the federal government beginning to step in terms of the public assistance programs, cash assistance programs. During this period of time, there was a movement, I suppose, called Eugenics, and I think if you look that term up in the dictionary, or the root of that term at least, it says something about for the good of mankind, or for the good of humankind, I should say, eugenics. And this was a movement that advocated for the sterilization of inferior peoples, and generally in those days those individuals were considered to be anyone who wasn't Anglo-Saxon or Germanic in their backgrounds. So the Northern European thing was really considered to be the superior races, the superior peoples, and this movement, which it kind of grows out of some of that social Darwinism and the Darwinian theory, about the survival of the fittest and everything. This movement really kind of set the early thinking in motion that underlied the development of the Nazi movement in Europe, which really took eugenics and the whole idea of a superior race to a horrible extreme. This line of thinking, really, I think it probably even there's a strain of it going on today still, but even into the 70s and the 80s with some of the state government programs about sterilization of poor women, welfare recipients and things. And remember again that disproportionately a higher percentage of minorities receive assistance than Caucasians, and so there are some racial and ethnic overtones to programs which encourage welfare recipients to, have a Norplant, put in their bodies, to prevent pregnancy, or to be sterilized so they can't have more children if they're receiving welfare, those kinds of things. The belief, as far as economics go in the time, was that the invisible hand of the marketplace was the reason that there was prosperity during this era, that all these profits and jobs and wages that were going up, again, for those who were fortunate in this era, had to do with the fact that the marketplace took care of things themselves. There wasn't any belief at that time, or at least there was a desire to not believe that governments needed to regulate anything in the business world. And so, with this kind of philosophy, there was really a reaction against people receiving public benefits whatsoever. Anybody who was involved in reform movements, helpers and those kinds of things, social workers and those kinds of things were, it wasn't like an outright kind of thing that said that they were un-American, but there was this implication that if you were engaged in some sort of reform, that you really were opposed to the American system of capitalism. This was based in part upon the worries about the Bolshevism, the socialism, taking a foothold around the world. It was, I believe, in 1917 when Lenin and his followers overthrew the Tsar in Russia, and communism was established for the first time in Moscow. And other countries as well had socialist influences in their government. It was sort of the thing of the day politically. And I hesitate to compare the Tea Party to that, but it was, I think, probably the Tea Party isn't as big of a political movement as socialism was at that time, but it was something similar to that, something very different and something new. And so again, that really threatened the status quo as far as capitalism was concerned, and particularly those, of course, who are successful are the ones who are also in control in a culture or society. It was very threatening, the thought of socialist incursions. And so people who advocated for reform and advocated for programs that redistributed income, such as social workers, were really considered to be perhaps un-American. And so a lot of what happened is a lot of workers, in order to protect themselves, left poor relief and casework during this period of time. And social reform, the social reform movement, as we'll see in a bit here, really kind of died out because of that. I wanted to talk about, we're going to combine a look at the different special groups like we've been talking about from week to week, women and labor and African Americans. So we're going to combine that presentation of issues this week also by looking at the reforms that affected each of those populations during the Progressive era. And you see here, it's a great little. This is specifically about suffrage, I believe, because you see women on the top, I believe, and if I'm not mistaken, at least, the steamroller of progress is overrunning the opposition is pretty clear. And I think it's a good cartoon from that era to kind of illustrate what was happening. Starting with labor and working conditions, one of the biggest things that occurred during this period of time was the implementation of child labor legislation. This was mostly left to the states. The federal government allowed the states to kind of make their own decisions about this, but it became very, very widespread around this period of time. A decrease in child employment with restrictions placed on who could work and one of the ways that they managed to get the children out of the workforce was to establish compulsory education laws, which required children under a certain age to be in school. Those compulsory education laws continue. One of the effects of that is that it keeps children out of the labor market, and so more jobs would open up for adult men, and fewer people looking for work meant higher wages, and so that was good for the worker, but the owners didn't care for it so much because their profits decreased because they were paying more for wages. And so child labor wasn't universally loved during that. Child labor legislation, I should say, wasn't universally appreciated in those times. We look back in this period of time and talk about the implementation of child labor as though somehow we had become a more enlightened society, and we were going to try to get our kids off the factory lines and out of the meat packing plants and out of the coal mines and things like that. My own father worked in a coal mine during this period of time. Quit school in 8th grade in order to go help his mother and father support the other children. And well, child labor legislation was being implemented during that period of time, but it was something that really wasn't so much about intended to benefit children as it was to get those kids out of the labor market, because they were working for much less, and there was too much adult unemployment. If just from reading The Jungle, you can see the kind of the issues that might have been going on at the time as far as employment was concerned. And so this really was for the economic benefit of our society. It really wasn't so much about children. A lot of people, again, especially the owners, kind of pressed this notion because it was really resulting in a decrease in profits, that the child labor legislation really was a sort of a socialist kind of movement and anti-family and those kinds of things. Other kind of changes in the area of labor during this period of time was that women began to get more protection from excessive work hours, and also workers' compensation, or workmen's compensation as it was called in those days. There were laws passed in 10 states by 1911. Now, what is workmen's compensation? For those of you that aren't familiar with that, every employer is required now, at least most businesses certainly are required to insure their workers against injury on the job, and actually you pay a little bit of a tax to the state up to a certain amount in order to help contribute to that insurance fund, and it's called the Employment Security something, ESC. You often find it on your pay stubs in Alaska. And if you were injured on the job while you were working, and the workers' compensation, workman's compensation, would pay for your doctor, and if you have to be out of work, would pay for part of the time away or part of your salary during the period of time that you're out of work, if that's an injury that happened on the job. If Jurgis had workers' compensation, he and Ona and the kids have been a lot better off than they wound up being, but really didn't have it in those days. Now, switching to taking a look at how women were faring during this era, as I mentioned, more participation in the labor force and somewhat better working condition, at least in terms of hours. But as far as the popular belief in our culture was concerned, women's primary function continued to be to perpetuate the race. They were here for childbearing most of all, but in the work world, they began to get equal pay. Although if employers had to pay men and women the same, their preference was to hire men in most situations. Women had those two movements we talked about last week, the temperance movement and the suffrage movement. Both of them found success during this era. In 1919, the Women's Christian Temperance Union managed to secure passage of the Prohibition Amendment in Congress, which prohibited the use of alcohol around the nation. And so they were successful in achieving prohibition. And the year after that, the suffrage movement won the right for women to vote. So it really was an era of some pretty big social changes just within a year or two. Because of that, these were the two big movements that women were involved in. Really, the women's movement in general kind of died out until around the 1960s, when it all picked up again, and we'll be talking about that in a few weeks. During this period of time, about 100 years ago, syphilis was really kind of the big problem in the health area, an increase in venereal disease. And if you remember when we were talking about the cult of true womanhood the week before, women were not seen as being particularly sexual creatures, and in fact, kind of more evolved and above the need for sex. That if they were bearing children, it was only because they were doing that to fulfill their duties. And so, I think then the proper woman really wasn't a very sexual person, at least in the light of day. And so, what happened is a lot of the husbands in these marriages decided that they needed to turn to prostitutes to have their own overwhelming male sexual urges taken care of, and so they wind up bringing home venereal diseases to their wives, and this was all blamed on the prostitutes and on the frigid women that they were married to. It really wasn't something that was the fault of the men in the popular thinking of those days. So it tells you a little bit again about life in patriarchy. Abortion and contraception actually were more acceptable towards the end of this period of time, and that was when things began to crumble in preparation for the Great Depression economically, and so there were a lot of economic problems and an increase late in this era of dependency needs and things. And so one way to decrease the population of needy persons was to kind of be more flexible about abortion and contraception. Again, a lot of these social changes that we're talking about that occurred during this era wasn't really about the good of the people that the changes were, benefiting. It really was more about economics. And that is what happens in a capitalist society. The dollar is the most important thing. For families and children, as we had implied last week, juvenile courts were becoming established as they began to recognize that kids needed to be dealt with by the judicial system differently. They understood things differently, and they needed to be handled differently. Courts were acting, and the Latin is in parens patriae, and I don't know if that's the proper pronunciation or not, but basically what it means is instead of parents. So judges could make decisions and rulings on behalf of children that as though they were the mother or the father, so to speak. So if kids were caught shoplifting, they could be taken off the street and taken away from their family and, put in apprenticeships or farmed out, or, those kinds of things, all the way through their 21st birthday, just for minor offenses and things like that. And it was all considered to be in the best interest of those children. That's going to change, but not for a period of time. But there will be some decisions made by the courts in the 1960s that will alter how juvenile courts work with kids. But during this period of time, at least, juvenile courts had surfaced, and it was a positive development to see children being dealt with differently in the judicial system. And casework was a part of the judicial or the juvenile courts too. The whole idea was that the juvenile courts were established in the best interests of the children and not to punish them. The federal government became more interested in child welfare. Again, this is something that was sort of implied late in the period that we studied last week. And the philosophy of the federal government was that children should remain in their own homes except for what was referred to as urgent and compelling reasons. The idea being, remember, we were talking about the federal government being more inclined to provide direct assistance to families than charitable organizations. And this is sort of how the federal government, or the government in general, began to take up responsibility for public assistance payments and things like this. And remember, again, with the implementation of the income tax amendment in 1913, the federal government had the means now to begin to provide for that. There were mothers' pensions or widows' pensions also established during this period of time, although, again, that was mostly for white people. And if you were elderly, you were still pretty much out of it as far as any kind of benefits go from the government, although aid to the blind and old age assistance programs were established during this period of time. For African Americans, there really wasn't much help out there either from the public or the private sector. The social work profession, in fact, was pretty much ignoring the needs of African Americans during this period of time, and what social services they were getting largely were provided through black women's clubs and mutual aid societies. They were really helping themselves. They weren't getting much help outside of that. the belief was during this period of time that the problems that blacks were living with resulted from what was seen as the deviance in their family system, the matriarchal structure that well, if you do some reading on this, you come to find that what we see as kind of the norm for what was seen as kind of the norm for African American families those days, that the fathers at the time were absent and the mothers and grandmothers raised the children, really has its roots in slavery, and it's a very interesting kind of read as you explore that and research that a little bit more. That the institution of slavery continued to have its impact upon the family structure. The Ku Klux Klan saw an increase in activity during this period of time, and that is something that you're going to see pretty routinely throughout our history whenever there are economic problems. The KKK kind of rears its ugly head. For Native Americans, 1924 saw their I forget the name of the act, but granted full citizenship by act of Congress to Native Americans, which is interesting in that this was their country to begin with. But nonetheless, Native Americans still largely remained wards of the federal government. Phyllis Day writes about this. That most of them continued to live on reservations and really weren't really brought into the culture whatsoever in the least. For veterans, there was an expansion of benefits both before and after World War I, and the benefits that veterans received included things like direct cash assistance, rehabilitation services, readjustment services after the war. Veterans hospitals were established. What is now today thought of as PTSD, which is what you hear of that soldiers experience, coming at war and coming back home, and you read about examples of some of what appears to be post-traumatic stress responses after the soldiers have come home. In those days, I believe was referred to as shell shock. There was a different term used in World War I and World War II, and I believe the World War I term was shell shock. I could have that wrong. but basically they were talking about what we call PTSD today and the readjustment services. The federal government established the Veterans Bureau in 1920. Again, a significant thing here because the federal government is establishing a social service bureau within its own structure. Veterans in general were considered to be worthy poor, just normal people who had had to deal with a great deal of stress. The social work profession began to see some changes as we saw the settlement house reformers. Well, we didn't. I wasn't here in those days, but they saw the settlement house reformers being excluded from the profession. And this has a lot to do with what I told you earlier about the concerns about labor unions being connected to socialism and reformers being a part of the socialist or Bolshevik movement, and so this was an area of work that was not particularly appreciated in society and was actually kind of suspect during this period of time. And so as the profession emerges with the first textbook, once again, Mary Richmond's Social Diagnosis, casework becomes the focus of the profession. And if you remember from our earlier discussions, casework really focuses upon that medical model of personal change, that there's something wrong with the individual and that we need to work with the individual to fix, to help them adjust to the society. And unlike settlement house reformers and other reformers that would work on social change, seeing the problem being in society itself, the social work profession adopted the casework personal change focus. And I think if you think about it again in context of the time, that had to do with the fact that that was about the only way the profession was going to survive through this era where reformers were considered to be not good people.
So the social welfare system itself saw an increase in bureaucratization, that's with the federal government intervening, and more accountability as well. So there was concerns about services getting to the right persons, that people really be truly needy when they got services, that type of thing. Okay, so the rest of that we've really pretty much talked to death. Government bureaucrats, and I say that lovingly because I work for the government, but government bureaucrats manage poverty programs. Casework, meanwhile, focused on mental health services, psychiatry, and school social work. And so really the domain of social work kind of splits here. And this is sort of a if you're thinking back to the two branches of social work from a week or two ago, we're really talking about the quote unquote professional branch of social work kind of splitting off here. And so the government, the individuals concerned about providing assistance to poor families, direct assistance to poor families, were working for the government. And the government was administering those anti-poverty programs, whereas the other people who were in the professional branch, so to speak, were focusing on things like mental health needs and psychiatry, working with children in schools and those kinds of things, really kind of leaving the whole domain of poverty to the government. And so Phyllis Day, and she does tell you pretty clearly she's unhappy about this, that the profession left the whole notion of social reform behind as immigration levels decreased, and because there were people that were very, very suspicious of what social reform was all about, and the demands for law and order, and the fact that social workers just did not want to be seen as subversives like reformers were. The economy was prospering, and the emphasis really kind of shifted then. As remember, we had talked about this in the first or second week, that in a society where it's seen as though society is functioning well, the emphasis shifts to individual change, personality reform, looking at how families function and things like that, so that really working with the individual would be the key to the change and well-being. And I close out this week's lecture just with a few photographs that I kind of pulled off of the web that I think kind of illustrate some of the issues that were the big issues of this particular era. My favorite photograph is the one on the upper left where they're campaigning with the "We Want Beer" signs, and so it shows you they were pretty desperate back in those days, and during Prohibition, they wanted their beer back. And if you look off to the right, there's an implication there that, of course, Prohibition was lifted, and I believe it was in 1933. It's actually not in this particular era that we're studying, but not long afterwards. That was one of the first things, actually, that Franklin Roosevelt did, I think, when he became president, was to try to help push through the end of Prohibition through Congress. And there was another constitutional amendment that invalidated the one that implemented Prohibition. But for a short period of time, the WCTUs were successful in controlling alcohol, made it illegal. You also see below the beer campaigners there, the pictures of some women there with their horns, and this was at least said to be some of the suffragettes, those individuals campaigning for the vote for women. And you can see also a cartoon about, or it's not a cartoon, but an animated poster about how women bring all voters into the world, so we should let women vote. Also in the upper right, the Monopoly Man. Well, we're talking about big government and trust busting, and so monopoly is kind of self-explanatory there, I think. And finally, Teddy Roosevelt's the photograph there of the big smiling face on the right-hand side is Teddy Roosevelt, our favorite trust buster and president from 1901 to, I believe, 1909. And in the lower left is Silent Cal Coolidge. Coolidge was a president late in this period of time, not at the very end, but late in this period of time, from Vermont.
There's also a photograph of Calvin Coolidge at the bottom with an Indian headdress on, and this is at the time when Coolidge was the president. At the time that the Indians received citizenship, and so he was considered a pretty popular guy by that population during that era. So, just some illustrations to help you close out your thinking about this week's topic. Again, I want to encourage you, please, to get those papers in on the jungle. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. But look under the assignment section in the course, and you'll be able to submit it there. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll talk again soon.